We have Mark Cheathem, whom I heard years ago give a talk on Martin Van Buren and his papers. So he's very much a presidential scholar. And today he's going to talk about his newest book, Who Was James K. Polk? Mark?
Well, thank you all for having me. I suspect that this crowd is going to be a little bit more enthusiastic about history than some of my students, which is good. Not that my students don't love history, they do. They just don't have the perspective, I think, maybe that those of us who are older do. I am a professor of history at Cumberland University in Lebanon, Tennessee, which is 30 miles east of here if you're not from the area. I'm also project director, as Gene alluded to, project director of the papers of Martin Van Buren, our 8th president, a New Yorker whose papers wound up in Middle Tennessee, which is a story for another day. We'll talk about Van Buren as part of my talk here in just a few minutes. So I'm going to be talking about my most recent book on the 1844 presidential election, Who is James K. Polk? When I gave my first talk on this book at the Polk home back, I guess it was in January of this year, someone pointed out to me how smart I was to publish this book on the 180th anniversary of the election. And I thought, well, actually, I wasn't smart at all. It was supposed to come out in 2020, and then a little something called COVID happened and delayed us. But in any case, it is convenient that it's an election year, and I suspect that there will be some parallels that will jump out at you as I go through my talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the candidates, kind of how they found themselves in the campaign running for president. I'll talk about some of the issues that they faced at that time, both before and then during the campaign. Of course, I'll talk about the results and then talk about some of the long-term ramifications of the election. So we're going to back up a little bit and talk about who was president, or who was supposed to be president, actually, when the 1844 campaign took place. In the 1840 campaign, if you don't remember, William Henry Harrison, who was the Whig candidate, defeated Martin Van Buren, who was the sitting president. Harrison, unfortunately for him, passed away 1 month into office. And, the Whigs, if you don't know the story of the Whig Party, the Whigs elected 2 presidents, both of whom died in office. So the moral of the story is, if the Whigs ever want to nominate you for president, don't do it. It's not going to turn out well. So Harrison passes away, and then his vice president, John Tyler, takes over. John Tyler had been put on the ticket to provide sectional balance for the ticket for the Whigs. He was sort of a contrarian. He had been a supporter of Andrew Jackson, then had turned against Jackson because he thought Jackson was too dictatorial. So he was someone really who the Whigs thought would pull in some of those Democratic votes, along with Harrison at the top for the Whigs. Unfortunately, John Tyler turned out to be an extremely unpopular president. How unpopular was he, Mark? He was so unpopular that within 6 months, he was a president without a party. From the time he took office in April of 1841 until September of 1841, Tyler took action after action that just frankly made the Whigs extremely angry with him. And part of it was him being a contrarian. He didn't want to be controlled. He was not a true Whig at heart. He thought that some of the Whig party leaders like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were trying to manipulate him, and he was not going to be manipulated. So Tyler spent the first 6 months of his presidency fighting against his own party primarily, to the point where they kicked him out of the party. And he will spend the remainder of his presidency as a president without a party, which is not a good position to be in if you're president. So Tyler's going to have a difficult time, but that opens the door for other candidates potentially to come in, both within the Whig Party and, of course, with the Democratic Party, to come in and to take over the White House once his term was over. The Whigs have a number of potential contenders now that Tyler is persona non grata in the party. As they're looking ahead to 1844, The Whigs have people like John McLean, who was a Supreme Court justice. McLean had been extremely eager in previous years to become president. Even after taking a Supreme Court seat, he sort of dallied in the idea of running for the presidency. The Whigs also have Daniel Webster, the famous senator from Massachusetts, who had been a party leader from the beginning of the party in the mid-1830s. And then they also have Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott had actually been one of the potential nominees for the Whigs in 1840. He was a military hero, much like William Henry Harrison. Scott had fought in every major military engagement that the United States had participated in since the War of 1812. So he was an attractive figure for the Whigs. But the Whigs don't choose any of these men because their consensus nominee, and this is pretty clear even before the Whigs meet at their national nominating convention in 1844, Henry Clay is their guy. Henry Clay had been around for, at that point, since the 18 teens in Congress. He had been part of what was called the War Hawk faction within Congress during the War of 1812, advocating for the war against Great Britain. He had helped to settle the peace treaty between the United States and Great Britain that concluded the War of 1812. He had been Speaker of the House. He had helped to negotiate two major compromises, the Missouri Compromise in 1819 through 21, and then the Compromise of 1833 that averted civil war in 1832-33. Henry Clay had run for the presidency, so this was not an uncomfortable position for him. He had never succeeded at this point, of course, and spoiler alert, he never gets to the White House. He was someone who had all of the tools, I think, that were necessary to win the presidency, and he probably would have been a good president, but there's some things that hold him back. One of the things that holds him back is he has a reputation of being kind of a scoundrel. Someone who plays hard, who drinks hard, who chases women hard. And that reputation had been with him since his time during the War of 1812. So that was something that he always fought against when he was running for president, and that is going to become an issue in 1844 as well. But at this point, the Whigs are not concerned about that. The Whigs are set on nominating Clay. They think he is the best chance to win the White House in 1844. The Democrats have a plethora of potential nominees that they could pull from. And these are not all of them. I tried to pull out the ones that were the most significant in 1844. So on the left, you have Lewis Cass, who had been a cabinet member under Andrew Jackson. He had been the territorial governor of Michigan. He had been a diplomat in Europe. So he was someone who had a range of experiences that made him potentially a good choice. In the middle is Martin Van Buren, the former president, who had also been vice president and secretary of state. He was a major figure within the Democratic Party for those reasons, but also because he and Andrew Jackson had formed the party. Van Buren was sort of the brains behind the operation, and Jackson was more the public figure when the party was formed. So Van Buren was someone who Democrats trusted for the most part. He was someone who had proven that he could win. And for many Democrats, they're looking at him and they're saying, you know, what happened in 1840 when the Whigs beat Van Buren, that was a fluke. That was not something that could happen again. Could it? So that's sort of in their mind that Van Buren is the guy, maybe. And then they also have Richard M. Johnson there on the right, who had been Van Buren's vice president, had also served in the Senate, had fought in the War of 1812. Johnson, for some people, was attractive as a candidate, but he had his own issues. One of his issues that had come up when he ran for the vice presidency was that he had lived openly with not just one, but two African-American women both of whom were enslaved by him. And with one of those women, not only had he lived openly in a common law marriage, but they also had had 2 daughters together. And so in this era in which white enslavers and enslaved African American women having relationships was not unusual, the problem for Johnson was that he was public about it. He was unapologetic about it. And that had cost him some issues in his political career. And so there are people who are big Johnson supporters, but that's always something I think that was going to hold him back from actually winning the nomination at the 44 Democratic National Convention. So when the Democrats meet in Baltimore in May of 1844, they have a number of men they can choose. The ones I mentioned, I didn't mention John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator. I didn't mention Charles Stewart, who was a naval commodore, and there are others as well. So they have, again, a feast of candidates that they could go to. Going into the convention, it looked very much like Martin Van Buren would be the front runner, that he would probably carry the nomination fairly easily. Unfortunately for Van Buren, there's an issue that arises right before the convention, and that issue is Texas annexation. Texas annexation was something that had been discussed for a number of years, but the United States started getting serious about that issue, about bringing Texas into the Union in 1843-44. And Van Buren had been asked about it, and he had publicly responded, and his response was that he was not in favor of the immediate annexation of Texas because he thought it would bring warfare, and then he implied also that it would stir up the slavery controversy. So that is something that, and this happens about 2 months before the convention meets, that issue is something that's going to erode Van Buren's support going into the convention. And I don't think neither he nor his supporters quite understood how important and explosive that issue was going to be for him. So the delegates meet, they begin to cast ballots. On the first few ballots, Van Buren is the leader. He has the majority. But the Democrats have this quirk when it comes to their nominations. When they had their first convention back in 1832, they had put into place a rule that said that their nominees had to have a 2/3 majority to be the nominee. And the reason for this, ironically, was because of Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson had chosen Van Buren to be his running mate, and he wanted Democrats to understand that this was his successor. Well, Democrats, many of whom supported Jackson and supported Van Buren, didn't want to be told what to do. And so through some maneuvering, I know, shocking, right? Through some maneuvering, what the delegates at the 32 convention decided was, let's set a 2/3 majority. That way, when Van Buren hits that 2/3 majority, we can say he doesn't just have a majority of votes, he has the overwhelming support of the delegates. And that's exactly what happened. Well, now fast forward 12 years, and all of a sudden, this is actually going to kill Van Buren's chances of getting the nomination. Because even though he has a clear majority starting out, his vote counts, his delegate counts continue to go down with each ballot. And it's clear he is not going to be the nominee. And so now Democrats are faced with a decision. So as this is going on in the daytime, delegates are casting their votes, ballot after ballot. At night, you have delegates who are working together to try to figure out who's an alternative that we can bring forward. Who is someone who can unite the Democratic Party in a way that it's obvious that Van Buren and some of these other men cannot. And so you have a group of Tennessee delegates and a group of New England delegates who begin to meet in the evening and sometimes late into the night to talk about who's our alternative here. The Tennessee delegates come in with a plan, and it's a plan that they had concocted with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had summoned some of the Tennessee delegates to the Hermitage before the convention when it was clear that Van Buren had blown his opportunity with Texas. And Jackson and these delegates talk about who could we perhaps put forward if it becomes clear that Van Buren's not going to be the nominee. Who's our safety valve? Who's the person that we can turn to if Van Buren's not going to be the nominee? So 3 of those delegates are up on the screen. 3 of the Tennessee delegates: Cave Johnson, Gideon J. Pillow, and Andrew Jackson Donaldson. Some of these names may be familiar to you. Cave Johnson will later serve in Polk's cabinet. He essentially acts as Polk's de facto campaign manager during the 1844 campaign. Gideon Pillow, probably you know his name from the Civil War, but at this point he's a pretty staunch Polk ally and Polk friend and a Democratic operative. And then you have Andrew Jackson Donaldson, who was Andrew Jackson's nephew, one of many named Andrew Jackson, by the way. If you ever try to do Jackson family genealogy, good luck, because there are so many Andrew Jacksons and Rachel Donaldsons running around. In any case, it's frustrating. But in any case, Andrew Jackson Donaldson had been Jackson's private secretary when he was in the White House. Donaldson's wife, Emily, had served as First Lady because of Rachel's death. Donaldson was very close to Jackson. And so these 3 delegates go to Baltimore with marching orders. And I say marching orders. There's no smoking gun where we know for sure that Jackson said, go do this. But the circumstantial evidence to me is overwhelming to suggest that Jackson told them, if Van Buren's not going to be the nominee, then we have to put someone else's name forward. And then lastly, George Bancroft, who is a Massachusetts delegate. George Bancroft, who later will hold a cabinet position under Polk, will be famous as one of the United States' first real historians. He is working the New England delegations, trying to convince them that what the Tennessee delegates have brought to the table is the strategy that they need to follow. So what is the strategy? Well, the strategy is to begin to sell James K. Polk as the alternative to all of these other contenders. And so what these Tennessee and New England delegates do is they're going around talking to other delegations, the pro-Van Buren delegation, the pro-Cass delegation, the pro-Johnson delegation, and saying, it doesn't seem like your guy's going to be able to cross the finish line in first. Think about if your guy can't do that, think about Polk. Let him be your second choice. And what begins to happen is you have these delegations, all of whom have their favorite sons. They all begin to put Polk as their second choice. And as it becomes clear that none of the contenders, the frontrunners, are going to be able to pull it off, Polk emerges as the consensus choice of the Democratic delegates there in Baltimore. So, how did Polk get in that position? Well, again, I don't want to assume that everyone knows anything about Polk, so I'll just give you a little bit of a retrospective on his career to this point. Polk had entered Congress in the mid-1820s as a Jackson protege, as so many Tennessee politicians in the party did. He served in the U.S. House, worked his way up to being elected Speaker of the House, a position he served in until 1839, when he resigned and came back to Tennessee to run for governor. He wins the gubernatorial election of 1839, is talked about as a potential VP candidate with Van Buren in 1840. And then in 1841, Polk loses his reelection bid for governor. Those things happen. So he runs again in 1843. The 41 election had been a very close loss. So he runs again in 43, and he loses again in a close election. And so if you look at Polk's career, it's up, and then it starts to come down. And in 43, by the fall of 43, he looks like a politician whose career is on the back end, that maybe he just needs to go back and be a lawyer in Columbia and forget about politics. So how does he go from that to about 6 months later or 9 months later being the Democratic nominee? Well, first of all, Polk lost close elections, so it's not like he's losing in a landslide. Tennessee was a very closely contested state, and so losing was not unthinkable. Secondly, he is someone who had the endorsement of Andrew Jackson throughout his political career. In fact, by 1840, Polk was being referred to as Young Hickory. And of course, hopefully most of you know that one of Andrew Jackson's nicknames was Old Hickory. And so while the two temperamentally were very different, politically they were very similar. And so Jackson's endorsement of Polk, and Polk sort of carrying the mantle of the Jacksonian name forward politically, was something that carried a lot of weight in Tennessee and nationally. And lastly, and this sort of dovetails with the second point, Polk is someone who is firmly committed to Texas annexation. He is someone who believes in manifest destiny. He believes in westward expansion. And so as the Democratic Party is clearly looking for someone who's going to champion that issue, Polk emerges as the one who has the clearest direction and the clearest support for the nomination. So Polk is going to win the nomination. He is going to then spend the entirety of the campaign proving the trust that the Democrats put in him, that he is another Andrew Jackson. Politically, again, not temperamentally, very different temperamentally. So there are some other candidates who run in 1844. So we have the Whig nominee, we have the Democratic nominee. John Tyler actually will run a third party, or attempt to put together a third party run. He will wind up withdrawing from the race in August of 44 because Democrats and Whigs, neither one of them want him, and he can't cobble together enough people who like him that he's able to be viable. So there are already three candidates in the race: Tyler, Clay, Polk. Then you have James G. Birney, who runs on the Liberty Party ticket. Birney had been a Southern enslaver up until the mid-1820s. He had a religious conversion and did a 180. Between the mid-1820s and the time he's first nominated on the Liberty Party ticket in 1840, he turns from someone who enslaves African Americans to someone who sees slavery as a moral and biblical evil, that it is something that God hated. It's a remarkable transformation. Birney, in 1840, won a few thousand votes, didn't really have much of an impact on the election of 1840. Heading into 1844, however, slavery is becoming much, much more of an explosive issue. And so the Liberty Party looks at Birney as someone who might be able to probably not realistically win the election, but maybe throw the election into the House of Representatives, and then, who knows what could happen. So he's the fourth candidate running on an anti-slavery abolitionist platform. And then the fifth candidate, which shocks most people if they don't know about this election or don't know about Mormonism, is Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith had a vision, and this is from Smith's retelling to his advisory council. He had a vision that God wanted him to run for the president, and so he shared that with his advisors in the church in early 1844. He will run a campaign that is focused on winning the presidency, but it is more focused on implementing the theological vision of Mormonism in conjunction with the democratization of the United States. All right, so that's just a fancy way of saying that what Joseph Smith believes God wants him to do is he wants him to be involved politically, maybe even winning the White House, in order to put together a theodemocracy. That's the term that Smith uses. It's a democratic theological government based on the teachings of Mormonism. Smith has a lot of support within the church. He has missionaries who not only seek to convert other people to the church's teachings, but also now have an added directive to campaign for Smith across the nation, as they're also trying to save souls. Unfortunately, Smith is not going to actually survive the campaign. he will become the first assassinated presidential candidate in U.S. history. Not because of his presidential campaign, but because there were some former and some disgruntled Mormons who were very upset with his dictatorial views about power, about control within the church. There were concerns that he was espousing and spreading doctrines that they did not believe came from God. For example, plural marriage or polygamy being one of the main ones that was problematic for him. Smith will find himself being thrown in jail along with his brother. And then there's a mob of men who go to that Carthage, Illinois jail, and there's a gunfight, and Smith and his brother are shot and killed. So even though Smith's death is not as a result of his presidential campaign, one of the things that I argue is that if he had not been focused on the presidential campaign, if he had not been focused on winning the White House, then perhaps he would have been better able to focus on some of the issues that were happening internally within the church and within the city of Nauvoo where he lived. But in any case, he is not really going to have an effect on this campaign because he dies in June of 1844. And he realistically, and I think even he acknowledged this, that he didn't have a realistic chance of winning the campaign, naturally, supernaturally. I'm sure he thought that he could. But I think that what Smith was thinking was, even if he can't win the White House, maybe he could serve as an advisor to the president. Maybe he would be someone who could be in the ear of the president. But in any case, he's not going to survive. So just to kind of reorient us before we get to the issues and then kind of start wrapping things up. So the two main tickets, you have James K. Polk and George Dallas. George Dallas from Pennsylvania was the VP nominee for the Democrats. Pennsylvania was a key state, and so choosing someone as your running mate from a key state is oftentimes a strategy that presidents use. And then you have Henry Clay and his VP running mate, Theodore Frelinghuysen from New Jersey. And let me just pause here and point out, one of the reasons that Frelinghuysen was chosen, one of the main reasons he was chosen, was because he was known as a very moral, very upstanding man. And so it's sort of like you have the sinner and the saint on the ticket, to sort of balance out Henry Clay's reputation as a carouser. Frelinghuysen, who was as straight-laced as they came, was there to kind of salve or to make Whigs feel better about voting for Henry Clay if they had any moral compunctions. I always call Frelinghuysen sort of the Mike Pence of 1844. He's there to provide balance in a different way. So what are the issues? What are these candidates going to be campaigning on? Well, going into 1844, the expectation was that the issues would be what they had always been since the Jacksonian period began in the 1820s. It would be things like the economy, banks, and tariffs. Exciting topics, really get your juices flowing to argue about banking and tariffs. Political corruption, that had been a hallmark, not just of the Jacksonian period, but really from the beginning of U.S. political history. Political corruption is a concern. Personal character, not just Henry Clay's personal character, but the personal character of all the candidates was something that many voters thought would be the focus of the campaign. These issues don't go away. They're still part of the campaign, but what emerges as the main issues are things like nativism, anti-immigration sentiment, in particular anti-immigration sentiment against Irish Catholics coming from Ireland, coming from France, coming from other parts of Europe. Beginning in the 1830s, there had been huge waves of Irish and Catholic immigrants coming into the United States, and those waves continued to increase in number. And so by the summer of 1844, the tension between native-born Americans and these recent immigrants was so the tension was so high that violence was breaking out against immigrant populations, particularly in New York and Philadelphia, other northern urban areas. So that is something that the candidates and the parties probably didn't expect to be part of the equation, but they have to address it because of the outbreak of violence. Slavery, as I mentioned earlier, is becoming much, much more significant as an issue. It had always been an issue, but it's becoming more significant. And then as we were talking about, westward expansion, particularly Texas, is becoming a major issue that the candidates have to deal with. So the results of the election are very close. There are about 40,000 votes that separate James K. Polk and Henry Clay. But as we know, the popular vote does not matter. All that matters is the electoral vote. God bless the founders for the Electoral College. The electoral vote is the only thing that matters. So if you just look at the map and you ignore the popular vote, you might look at it and think, well, 170 to 105, that's not a particularly close election. It's not a landslide, but Polk seems to win pretty comfortably. But in fact, it's a fairly close election because of how slim the margins were in some of the states between Clay winning or Polk winning. Very, very slim margins in many of the states. So this election was one that could have been changed if one state had been different, or if a number of smaller states had been different. So I'll talk a bit more about that. So, and this is where, if I put this up for my students, they would glaze over. They would go to sleep immediately. So if you're not already asleep, this is not the time. We're almost done. But I put this up here because I don't think people realize how close this election was when it came to it going one way or the other. So if you look at these states and look at the differences, and both in terms of total numbers of votes and then in percentages, these are extremely tight state elections. So, for example, if you look at Tennessee, down at the bottom, Tennessee goes to Clay by 113 votes. 113 votes. Much to Jackson's chagrin. He's not happy about this. By the way, Tennessee consistently goes for the Whig presidential candidate during this era. And to me, that's a testament to how divisive and polarizing Jackson was, that he was someone who you either loved or hated, and oftentimes Tennesseans hated him. But it's a close election. It's a very close election. Other states, it's not necessarily the number of votes, but it's the margin of victory, the percentage of victory. So, New Jersey, 0.69%. I know mathematicians out there saying you can't have decimals and percentages together, but just bear with me. 0.69%. But there's one state that, and I'm going to talk more about it in just a minute, but there's one state that's pretty critical, and that's New York. New York is separated by 5,000 popular votes, a little over 1% difference. But notice that New York, if it had switched from Polk to Clay, New York would have made a difference in who won the election. With the other states that are close, you would have to have cobbled together several of those states to have made a difference, to make a swing from one side to the other. But New York is kind of the pivot point. If it had flipped, if those 5,000 votes had gone a different way, then Henry Clay would have been president in 1844. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So how does Polk win? How is it that a man whose political career seemed to be on the downside, seemed to be in a tailspin the year before, the following year is now the most powerful man in the United States government? There are several things that I think happened that helped him win. First of all was Texas annexation. This issue got him the nomination, and this issue, I think, helped him win some states that he might not have won otherwise, particularly in the South. Now, on the flip side of that, it may also have cost him states in the North. For example, Ohio probably went to Clay because of Texas annexation. But it's a factor. It is something that gets him nominated. It's something that he and the Democrats ride consistently throughout the campaign, that they are going to bring Texas into the Union and help expand the United States. Secondly is that vote in New York. Historians for decades talked about how the reason that New York voted for Polk over Clay is because Liberty Party voters did not vote for Henry Clay. That James G. Birney's candidacy was a spoiler that drew votes away from Henry Clay. I would contest that. I would argue that if you look at what the Liberty Party leaders decide to do when they nominate Birney, and even after they nominate him, some of them have second thoughts and they say, do we really want this guy? Because he's a true believer. He is someone who is looking at slavery as a moral issue, no compromise. Should we take a more pragmatic approach and maybe choose someone that still thinks slavery is bad but is willing to work with one of the other parties? Or do we maybe endorse Clay or endorse Polk and form a political alliance with them? The Liberty Party decides not to do that. And so what I would argue is that the Liberty Party votes that historians have consistently said would have been Clay unless, I would argue that they were never Clay's to begin with. Liberty Party men either were going to vote for Birney or they were going to stay home. There was no compromise when it came to the 1844 election for them. And unfortunately, we don't have polling, so, well, not that polling's that accurate nowadays, but, we can't really get a good sense of what individual voters are thinking. But as I did my research, I became very convinced that this is what happened, that the Liberty Party men voted for Birney, and if they had not had him as an option, they were simply not going to vote for anybody. Thirdly, the immigration issue, I think, makes a big difference. Democrats at this time are very strongly pro-immigrant. Whigs are very anti-immigrant. And so immigrants who were eligible to vote overwhelmingly voted for Democrats in places like New York, again, where the election was decided. There were people at the time who argued, well, the Democrats just have a bunch of immigrants illegally voting. Well, I'm here to tell you, folks, both sides had people illegally voting, and it usually wasn't immigrants. The ballot stuffing and double voting and some of the shenanigans that went on would make us blush today. There was legitimate corruption happening. But in any case, I think the anti-immigrant sentiment of the Whigs cost that party votes, and I think it helps Polk and the Democrats to win those votes. Fourthly, and this is something that we don't usually think about when it comes to presidential elections, because we're usually thinking of whoever's running for president is pulling people into the voting booth, right? So you're sort of a top-down. If you have an interesting presidential election, more people will turn out and cast down ballot votes. In New York, which was Van Buren's home state, there are lots of New York Democrats who are not happy with the Democratic Party. They're not happy with Polk's nomination. But they have a candidate running for governor, Silas Wright, who is a very strong Democrat, a strong Van Buren ally, and someone who had turned down the nomination at the Democratic convention when things were very murky, had turned down the nomination, and his gubernatorial campaign actually brings more Democratic voters out who vote for Polk than probably would have turned out if he had not been running. Silas Wright outpolls James K. Polk in New York. So instead of having the president pulling voters in, it's actually Silas Wright pulling voters in to vote for president and to vote for Polk as president. So Silas Wright, to me, is one of the more fascinating, overlooked figures of this era. He is a very crucial political figure, not just in New York, but nationally. What's that?
Did he win?
He did win, yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then lastly, one of the other issues that helped Polk win was the fact that the Democrats began to adopt the Whig approach to campaigning. In the 1840 election, you remember I said at the very beginning that Democrats thought that this was a one-off, this was a fluke. How could the Whigs defeat, Martin Van Buren, the founder of our party? Well, what the Democrats had chalked the loss up to, mostly, was the fact that the Whigs engaged in silly campaign tactics, which today are part of the mainstream, but back then were unique. So, for example, they held political rallies. They sang political songs. They gave political speeches in public. They had political cartoons like this. They involved women in coordinating political events, even though women couldn't vote. The Whigs had used all of those things to help win in 1840, and the Democrats had kind of turned their nose up at it. By 1844, the Democrats have seen the light. They understand that if we're going to win politically at the national level and certainly at the state level, we have got to adopt this course of action. This is the path of the future. This is how you get voters engaged. And the really interesting thing is, even though Polk and Clay don't go out and campaign themselves, this was a lesson that Polk had learned at the state level. When he was running for governor, he did these things. And so the Democrats finally wake up in 1844 and they leveled the playing field when it comes to these kinds of campaign tactics and strategies. Again, whether it's for good or not today, it was the beginnings of our type of modern campaigning. So what are the consequences? And I'll wrap up with this. So what are the consequences? Well, there are a multitude of consequences that we could talk about, but in the immediate period, the two main consequences were that Texas became part of the United States, and John Tyler signs that right before he leaves office, so he kind of steals Polk's thunder. Polk will come into office intent on expanding the United States geographically. In 1846, he positions U.S. troops on a disputed border with Mexico, which provokes Mexico into firing on U.S. soldiers, which then Polk turns around and uses to justify going to war. Over 2 years, the United States will expand into Mexico, into Mexican territory, and by the time the war is over and the peace treaty is signed, the United States has grown tremendously in terms of its acreage and geography. As that happens, you have Americans, particularly in Congress, who begin to talk about what are we going to do about slavery in this new Western territory. And that really becomes one of the main congressional themes over the next few years. It's the idea or the debate about what do we do? Even though slavery in many places out west was not viable, at least not viable in the way that Americans had used it, there is still this argument about should these states allow slavery or not? And that has all kinds of ramifications politically, economically, socially, and in other ways. So Polk's election is a major, major turning point, I would argue, in the United States' path to the Civil War. It's not the first domino. I'm not saying it's the main domino, but it is an important step in the United States beginning to move towards civil war in 1860-61. So are there any questions? I know in a group like this, no one has any questions. No, I'm joking. Yes?
I apologize for being late. You might have covered this before I got in here, but I wonder if you could talk a bit about Polk's predecessor, Tyler, who I've written before, just an opinion column, that I thought he was a vastly underrated president. Should be maybe not in the top 10, but next 10, because working basically without a political party, both parties disowned him, he still managed to work with his Secretary of State, Webster, and they had a long list of foreign policy accomplishments. And they, of course, as you mentioned, he was the one who actually annexed Texas. And he did so with a treaty, not with a treaty, but you would have between two countries, but through legislation.
Right.
That was later used as a precedent to annex the Philippines and Guam in 1898. And there were several other things like that. I just wonder if you could talk about them a little bit.
Yeah, I did talk about him a little bit at the beginning. One thing I will say is, and I didn't talk about this, is there is an incident that happens on February 28th, 1844, that changes Tyler's presidency and really changes the entire course of the campaign. So prior to February 28th of 1844, Tyler had been working with members of Congress to try to come to an agreement about how to annex Texas. And there had been a very tenuous coalition, voting coalition that had been put together that very likely would have voted for annexation to take place. And if the annexation of Texas had taken place in early 1844, before the two parties met, I don't know that Tyler still had a chance to be in the White House, but certainly I think we would view him differently. So the incident that happened on February 28th was the USS Princeton blew up. And on board of the Princeton were several cabinet members. The President Tyler, was also there. He was not on deck when it blew up.
He was listening to a singer downstairs.
Yes, right. So as a result of that, the Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, who had put together this very fragile coalition, he dies. And so Tyler has to put someone else in his place. The person he puts in his place is John C. Calhoun. And within just a couple of months, John C. Calhoun has injected slavery into the annexation debate. He essentially blows up that coalition. And so that is how annexation becomes such an important issue in 1844. If it had been resolved, then maybe Van Buren becomes the nominee. And then, I don't know if Van Buren would have won, but we would have had a different president and would have had a different trajectory. Yes.
Yes. I was taught somewhere along the way that Polk, when he went into office, said he had 4 things he wanted to do. And then once he got those done, he would leave.
Right.
Is that true?
No. So I was taught that too. So Tom Cheathem, who was editor of the James K. Polk, correspondence of James K. Polk project that is now finished, several years ago, probably about 10 years ago, wrote a very short book. It's less than 100 pages about this very thing. The thing about Polk was, of course, he had objectives going in. But what many people don't realize is that Polk made a pledge to only serve 1 term before he was nominated. And so he does that, by the way, because he thinks that if he doesn't do that, then Democrats like Van Buren and Johnson and others, that their supporters won't support him. And so by making that 1-term pledge, he opens up the opportunity that in 48, he won't be running for re-election, so all those guys can run again, so they have a chance. So he makes that pledge, early in the campaign, and again, he does have objectives, but those objectives are not clearly laid out, and then when they're done, he decides to leave office. It's not that way at all. It's a nice story, though, and I wish things were that neat. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to know how many delegates were at that Democratic convention, and was it determined by the population of the states?
261, I believe. I think you had to have 131 delegates to win the nomination. I'd have to actually look in the book to make double sure, but I think that's right.
And was it determined by population?
It depended. Each state determined how its delegates were selected, so it's not necessarily dependent on population.
The number by state?
No, because political parties at that time, the way we think about national conventions today, political parties at that time were not quite like political parties today. And so things weren't as rule-based or regimented as they are today, as organized maybe is a way to think about it. Somebody else had a question. Yes?
Jackson had marched the Indians to the west, the Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So how was that topic handled by Polk, or was it even an issue?
That's a great question. It's really not discussed. And that doesn't mean that it's not still an issue. It doesn't mean that it's not still something that was politically important. But the research that I did in the campaign newspapers, Democratic and Whig campaign newspapers, and then also with the Clay correspondents, Polk correspondents, and their advisors, that issue doesn't really come up at all. Mm-hmm. What is interesting, though, that Joseph Smith talks about it. So he actually has a platform. A lot of it is talking about how terrible the Democrats are because Van Buren had snubbed him when he was president. Not that Smith held a grudge. But that is one of his concerns. And partly it's motivated by the idea of religious conversion, I'm sure. But he talks about how mistreated Native Americans had been and being forced to move west, and that if he becomes president, that he wants to make sure that they are treated differently, that they're treated more equitably.
Which person was saying that?
Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet.
So there was no move to keep pushing the Native Americans further west?
I did not find anything about that in the 1844 campaign. Now, it may be there. I'm not saying conclusively that it's not, but I didn't find any mention of that being even a minor campaign issue. It's not part of the platform for either party.
There was a year what is it, the Chickasaw sent tons of grain to Ireland. Ireland was in a potato famine.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Was Polk nominated on the first ballot, or
No, it was
how did that go?
So his name came up on the 8th ballot for the first time, and he was nominated on the 9th ballot. Yeah, which, you know, again, political conventions today are nothing like they were then. But I was reading, I forget which election it was. Oh gosh, there were dozens of ballots, and I'm trying to remember which convention it was. There were dozens of ballots before they finally settled on someone. Can you imagine? The social media, how that would play out. Yes.
Would you comment on Sarah Polk?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I should have mentioned her earlier. Sarah Polk, I said that Cave Johnson acted as James K. Polk's de facto campaign manager. Really, Sarah did. Even before 1844, Sarah Polk essentially was James K. Polk's campaign manager during his gubernatorial campaigns. Which, if you know anything about this era, is very unusual for a woman to be so publicly politically active. So it's not like Sarah's in the background, you know, telling James, you know, you need to write this, you need to do that. She is writing politicians and saying things. She is setting up events for James to go to. And my impression is that sometimes there are times when James doesn't want to do things, and she's like, oh, yes, you are. You know, you're running for office. You're going to win this thing, buddy. Because he tended to have a more reserved, introverted personality is how he comes across. And Sarah was much more take charge and much more aggressive in seizing the reins and going for things. So she's crucially important. When I talk about Sarah, I always mention Amy Greenberg's biography of Sarah Polk. If you've not read that, you should read it. The first half of it covers Sarah's life when James was alive. The second half covers her life after James. And frankly, her life after James is even more interesting with her work in Nashville and all the stuff that she does in the Nashville area to preserve her husband's legacy and to do other things. She's just a fascinating, fascinating woman.
And what is all of the story about moving his grave?
For some reason, people like to dig up James K. Polk and move his body. I'm not really sure. I don't know why they're picking on this guy. I mean, there are plenty of other people we could pick on. I don't know all the backstory. There's probably somebody in the room who knows it better than I do. I know that more recently, the James K. Polk home in Columbia has wanted to move him to Columbia. Yeah, I don't really understand why they do that. But his body has been dug up a couple of times and moved. Just let the man rest is kind of what I think. Yep.
I apologize for
No,
coming
that's
in
all right.
late on
That's
base
right.
traffic, but did you talk earlier about how many slaves that Polk owned and where he owned slaves?
I did not, but James K. Polk and Henry Clay both own African Americans, enslaved African Americans. And that is, again, to go back to James G. Birney and the Liberty Party, that's one of the reasons that the Liberty Party just doesn't make a choice, is because they're both guilty in their eyes of enslaving African Americans. James K. Polk himself owns enslaved African Americans in Tennessee, but primarily in Mississippi. And I don't remember the exact number. I want to say it's over 100, but I don't remember exactly. But he is someone whose enslaver status becomes problematic during the campaign. In September, or it's actually late August of 44, there's a newspaper report that comes out in a New York newspaper talking about how James K. Polk branded his enslaved people, like put JKP on them as a brand. And it turns out that that was not the case. The story was made up by the Whigs. Shocking disinformation. Who knew that? But one thing it did do was it highlighted the fact that Polk was an enslaver, and then Democrats turn around and say, yeah, but your guy is too. Henry Clay owned enslaved people. And he had the opportunity early, even before he was the nominee, to kind of walk away from that, to step back from slavery and to say, this is bad and, we need to do something. And he had said, and I'm paraphrasing, if we free these enslaved people, what are they going to do? There'll be a race war. They're not going to know how to handle themselves. So that would be worse than actually keeping them in slavery. And so the slavery issue does affect both of those men's campaigns. And again, reinforces, I think, for the Liberty Party that they're just not an option, either in New York or anywhere else. Any other questions?
What year did Jackson die?
1845. 1845, yep.
Thank you very much. And